I have walked these corridors for 20 years, and yet each night they feel foreign. The neonatal intensive care unit does not forgive complacency. The air here is sharp with antiseptic, the kind that burns faintly in the nostrils, and the silence is never absolute. Machines breathe for the infants who cannot. Their monitors tick out fragile heartbeats in uneven rhythms, and the incubators themselves glow faint amber, casting the ward in a perpetual twilight. Routine is what steadies me. I begin each shift by synchronizing my watch to the master clock, mounted above the observation window. Every drug dosage, every recorded apnea episode, every feeding schedule, time is the axis of this place. Without precision, these children do not survive. I sip black tea at exactly 3 hours, when the lull sets in, when the staff numbers shrink, and the ward becomes an island of machinery and my own footsteps. I have long believed that these children arrive as blank slates. A newborn brain is scaffolding more than structure, neurons waiting for experience to shape them. They do not dream. They do not think, not in any way resembling the adult mind. This conviction has been my armor. To believe otherwise would be to imagine suffering or memory in a being who cannot yet protect itself. Tonight, the ward is thinly staffed. One nurse checks vitals at the far end, her shoes whispering on polished linoleum. Beyond her, glass partitions reflect the fluorescent lights, turning the incubators into ghostly doubles. I move between them slowly, inspecting, noting oxygen saturation levels, adjusting the curl of tubing. And then I notice him. Infant in pod 6, premature, still with translucent skin stretched tight over delicate bones. His eyes are open when they should be closed, the pupils impossibly steady. Newborns do not hold gazes. They flutter, they drift. But his eyes are locked on me, as if tracking, as if recognizing. I linger, one hand on the plastic dome, waiting for him to tire, to blink. Away, he doesn't. His chest rises in shallow but consistent rhythm, the monitor steady, but his stare presses into me with unnatural intent. I tell myself it is fatigue, that my perception is strained after too many consecutive night shifts. And yet, when I turn to move on, I cannot shake the sensation that I am being observed, not by an infant, but by something already aware. I wrote it off as nothing. Hours later, I would know better. The first words came at 03:17. I was reviewing the infant's vitals, oxygen saturation hovering at 94, pulse at 152, blood pressure barely a whisper. Nothing remarkable for his gestational age. My pen was halfway across the chart when I heard it. Increase oxygen, 2 liters. The voice was unmistakable, my own. Not an imitation, not a garbled mimicry. My tone, my cadence, delivered from a mouth that should only have been capable of reflexive cries. For several seconds, I froze, my pen suspended. The monitor beeped on, unconcerned. The infant's lips were moving, parting delicately around each syllable, tiny tongue pressing against toothless gums to form consonants that should have been impossible. It is crucial here to explain. A neonate lacks the musculature and neurological coordination required for speech. Their larynx sits higher in the throat, adapted for swallowing and breathing simultaneously. Words are anatomically impossible at this stage, and yet the sound was perfect. My first instinct was exhaustion. Hallucinations are not uncommon during extended night shifts, but hallucinations do not register on equipment. I checked the ward's digital recorder, which continuously captures ambient audio. Rewinding the last 30 seconds, I listened. My own voice, issuing those exact instructions, played back to me. The infant lay still, his pupils unwavering. I leaned closer, close enough to hear the faint rattle of ventilator tubing nearby. My reflection in the incubator dome seemed to merge with his. My lips nearly aligned with his tiny mouth. "Prepare intubation," he said. Or rather, I said, through him. I stumbled back, pulse hammering in my temples. There were no other staff nearby. The ward was silent except for the endless machinery. The words echoed in my head as if spoken into an empty theater. I called Naveed. His voice over the phone was groggy, irritated at being disturbed. When he arrived 20 minutes later, his lab coat hastily buttoned, he listened with arms crossed. "Audio artifact," he said after I played the recording. Crosstalk from another ward. Feedback loop. Anything but what you think you heard. I wanted to agree. I needed to. But as he turned to leave, the infant spoke again, softly this time, almost whispering. Dr. Aisha Rahman. My full name. Spoken clearly. Neither I nor Naveed had uttered it aloud. The resident's face paled, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. Coincidence. He made a sound, and your mind shaped it. Fatigue does that. He left me with the silence and the child's steady gaze. I began to write notes, my hand trembling for the first time in years. If there is one thing medicine teaches us, it is to document without bias. But how does one chart a voice that should not exist? The ward clock ticked toward 04 in Goki. I could not look away from pod 6. His mouth was closed now, but I could still hear the echo of my name, repeating in the cavern of my mind. I entered the next shift armed not with certainty, but with procedure. Protocol has always been my shield against the unknown. If something is unexplainable, you do not panic. You test, you isolate variables, you replicate. Science is built on repetition. The infant in pod 6 had not vocalized again during the day. Nurses reported only shallow cries and normal premature irritability. Yet the chart felt different in my hands, as though the paper itself bore weight it had not carried before. I set up a controlled test. I positioned myself beside the incubator, the faint hum of oxygen pumps filling the air. I spoke softly, words I might use in routine care. Check bilirubin levels. The infant stared, his gaze steady. A moment later, his lips parted. Check bilirubin levels. My own words returned to me, but not echoed, anticipated. His voice overlapped mine by a fraction of a second, as though spoken before I had fully formed the thought. This was no simple mimicry. Newborns cannot repeat words. Their vocal cords are capable only of reflexive cries and primitive coos. Speech requires cortical control, which does not mature for years. I explained this to myself in clinical terms, even as my pulse climbed. I repeated the test with random phrases: adjust incubator humidity, monitor heart rate, administer surfactant. Each time, the words surfaced a heartbeat before mine. It was not imitation. It was preemption. I drew an EEG, attaching the delicate electrodes to his scalp. The machine traced out jagged lines across the monitor, recording the infant's brain activity. I expected immature waveforms, chaotic bursts typical of premature neonates. Instead, the pattern resembled adult REM cycles, periods of rhythmic activity indistinguishable from dreaming. This is impossible. A neonate cannot dream in any meaningful sense. Their neural scaffolding lacks the architecture for sustained imagery. To explain this to a layperson, I might say, it is as if you examined a blueprint for a house and found not empty outlines, but a fully furnished living room already drawn inside. The design had skipped ahead to completion before the foundation was even poured. I documented the finding in detail, forcing my handwriting to remain steady. Every anomaly must be recorded, however absurd. Yet with each note, I felt as though I were writing not a case file but a confession. Naveed joined me later, drawn by equal parts skepticism and curiosity. He smirked at my setup, muttering about placebo effects. I replayed the recordings for him. This could be spliced, he insisted. Noise artifacts, your own voice bleeding through. Then explain this. I handed him the EEG printout. He studied it, the smirk fading. No, he muttered, shaking his head. This looks like REM. But that's not possible. This has to be mislabeled data. As if in response, Pod 7, another infant across the ward, stirred. His lips moved. Don't touch the sample, Naveed. The voice was not mine. It was Naveed's. His own tone, carrying a warning he had not spoken aloud. His eyes widened, blood draining from his face. That's a trick. He looked at me, almost pleading for agreement. But his gaze kept darting back to the infant, whose mouth had already gone slack in ordinary sleep. The ward felt colder, the hum of machines louder, as if amplifying the silence between us. I should have ended the tests there. Protocol would demand consultation, peer review, multiple confirmations. But something deeper than curiosity compelled me. Not professional duty, not even fear. Something more primal. I realized then. The anomaly was not isolated. The ward at night is a place of thresholds. Between sleep and wakefulness, between silence and alarm, between life and the faintest suggestion of death. I had grown used to these liminal hours, but now they carried a new texture, as though the air itself vibrated with anticipation. It began with a murmur. I was walking the row of incubators when I thought I heard a radio left on in another room. Indistinct voices overlapping, rising and falling. Yet the nurse's station was empty, the hallway beyond silent. The sound was inside the ward. I stopped beside pod 6, then pod 7. Their mouths twitched, but the sound came from everywhere at once, a chorus of whispers threading through the sterile air. Some were my own voice, faint and overlapping, sentences I recognized as things I had said before, instructions I had given years ago. Others were unrecognizable, tones male and female, urgent and mundane. The closest comparison I can offer is tuning a radio dial, every station faintly audible at once. But these were not broadcasts. They were futures. Words unspoken, moments unreached. I leaned closer, straining to isolate one voice. Suddenly, pod 10 cried out, not a wail, not a cry, but a full sentence in the voice of Dr. Hamid, my senior, physician from residency. Hamid had been dead for more than a decade. Clamp the cord now. The infant's lips parted, issuing his order in perfect cadence, as if we were back in the delivery room of my first emergency case. My knees nearly buckled. For a moment I smelled blood and iodine, a phantom memory conjured by the sound. Naveed rushed in, face pale, hands trembling. "The recorders," he said. "It's equipment. Feedback." His words tripped over each other, desperate, but the audio log was clear. I played it back, the chorus of voices captured in sterile digital precision. Even he could not deny what his own ears had heard. The horror grew sharper when the voices began to align with reality. Pod 12 whispered, "Alarm in 3 seconds." 3 seconds later, the monitor blared as oxygen saturation plummeted. Another voice predicted a bradycardia episode before it happened, giving me time to intervene. It was as though the infants were not merely echoing consciousness, but anticipating events, not guessing, knowing. I found myself caught between dread and necessity. If the voices could warn us, could they be used? Could we prevent collapse, anticipate crises before machines registered them? And what would that mean for medicine? For causality itself? Naveed would not hear of it. "You're chasing ghosts," he said, voice trembling. "You're letting madness into this ward." I wanted to argue. But then one infant spoke again. A voice so sharp, so personal, that my words died. It was Naveed's voice, his own tone, spoken from pod 9. "Car accident, night road, you won't survive." The baby's eyes fluttered, his lips falling silent. Naveed staggered back as though struck, his hands clutching the edge of a counter. He stared at me, then at the infant, then back at me again. There was no arrogance left, no smirk, only raw terror poorly hidden beneath denial. The whispers died down, leaving the ward in sterile silence. But the words lingered like a toxin in the air, impossible to breathe around. I did not know then that this was only the beginning. I should have abandoned. The ward, reported the anomaly, stepped away before it unmade me. Yet medicine does not allow retreat. When faced with the unknown, we do not run. We investigate. That, at least, is what I told myself. The voices persisted over the following nights. Not constant, but frequent enough to turn each hour into a vigil. Sometimes they came in whispers, other times in clear, unbroken sentences. And increasingly, they were mine. It is disconcerting beyond description to hear your own voice spoken from another's mouth. It was not merely mimicry. The infants spoke words I had not yet said, thoughts I had not yet formed. On the third night, I entered the ward to hear pod 6 murmur, "Order cranial ultrasound." I froze. I had not considered that test yet. But the suggestion was rational, appropriate. Minutes later, as I charted my thoughts, I realized the phrase had risen unbidden to my own mind, as if planted there. I complied. The ultrasound showed nothing remarkable. Ventricles normal, no hemorrhage, no calcifications. But the timing haunted me. The instruction had been correct before I had conceived of it. The next night the voices multiplied. At times it was as if the entire ward had become a chamber of myself. Dozens of versions of my voice layered one over the other, issuing instructions, corrections, warnings. Some contradicted each other. Increase O2. Decrease O2. Intubate. Now. Do not intubate. Each directive carried the authority of my own tone. It became impossible to know which were genuine thoughts and which were echoes bleeding backward from a future not yet lived. I conducted more structured tests, attaching EEG electrodes to multiple infants. The printouts filled the counter, a chaotic forest of lines. Each chart displayed bursts of rhythmic activity far beyond neonatal capacity. It was as though their brains were skipping developmental stages, leaping ahead into futures they had not yet reached. To explain it simply, imagine watching seedlings in the soil, and overnight, they bloom into flowers, then fruits, then collapse into withered stalks, all in a span of hours. Time itself was not behaving as it should within their tiny skulls. I told myself that if I could isolate the phenomenon, I could understand it. But deep down, I began to suspect the opposite, that, by seeking to study it, I was only deepening its hold. The climax came in the still hours of one shift, when the ward was mine alone. The incubators glowed like sentinels, monitors blinking their artificial constellations. My pen scraped across a chart when Pod 6 spoke again. Stop the ventilator now. My own voice, firm, absolute. I froze. The infant in question was stable. Fragile, but stable. Ventilator pressure was holding, oxygen saturation acceptable. To remove support would mean death. Another infant spoke. If you don't, 2 will die. The words overlapped, my own tone layered upon itself. One directive suicidal, the other salvational. Contradictions ricocheted through the ward. I stood trembling between incubators, stethoscope in one hand, pen in the other. For the first time in decades of practice, I did not know how to act. Science demands evidence, yet the evidence was fractured, recursive. Each voice claimed to be my own judgment from a future I had not yet reached. To act on one meant denying the other, and in doing so perhaps sealing fates I could not comprehend. An analogy comes to mind. Standing before 2 mirrors angled against each other, your reflection splintered into endless duplicates. Which is you? Which is real? Each is identical, yet each different. That was the sound of my voice in those moments. Infinitely split, collapsing inward on itself. I moved to the ventilator, hand hovering over the settings. Sweat dripped from my temples despite the chill of the ward. The monitors beeped steadily, indifferent to my paralysis. I whispered aloud, though my throat was dry. Which one of you is me? Dozens of lips twitched in the incubators. Dozens of tiny mouths parted. And in unison, they whispered back, all of us. The sound crawled over my skin like static electricity, raising every hair on my arms. I did not stop the ventilator. I did not alter a single setting. Instead, I fled the ward long enough to vomit in the restroom, gripping porcelain as the world spun. When I returned, the infants were silent. Only the machines spoke now. Their steady beeps the last semblance of order in a ward that had become a cathedral of impossible echoes. I knew then that the truth was simple, and it was unbearable. These children were not blank slates. They were repositories of futures unwritten, futures bleeding backward through time, and somehow I was entangled in their loops. I filed the report because it was all I knew to do. Protocol, even in madness. 20 pages of meticulous notes, EEG, printouts stapled, audio files referenced, timestamps aligned with clock logs. The language was clinical, stripped of fear. Subject vocalized. Waveform inconsistent with neonatal capacity. Audio recording confirms anomaly. Yet between each line was a silent admission. I do not understand what I have witnessed. Administration responded with polite dismissal. Equipment malfunction. Contamination of samples. Sleep deprivation leading to auditory misinterpretation. They buried the report in an archive, never to surface. Naveed refused to corroborate. He had seen enough to know the truth, but denial is its own survival mechanism. He mumbled about stress, about coincidence, and withdrew from the ward assignments thereafter. I lasted 2 more weeks. Each time I entered the ICU, my heart rate climbed. Every infant cry bent into familiarity. Every monitor beep felt like a countdown. And at odd hours, in the quiet lulls, I swore I heard faint whispers in the air, as though the incubators remembered me. Sleep deserted me. Each night I closed my eyes. I half expected to dream in the voices of those children, to wake with words already spoken in my own cadence. So I resigned. After 20 years, I walked away from the only place I had ever felt competent, leaving behind my watch, my charts, my routines. Colleagues assumed burnout. Let them. Burnout is easier to accept than the truth. Even now, months later, I hear it. Passing by a playground, a newborn's cry cuts the air. To others, it is the common wail of infancy. To me, it carries an unmistakable echo. My tone, my inflection, my own voice carried on lungs too small to contain it. I once believed that the future was earned through effort, through vigilance, through precision. That each life began blank, a canvas awaiting its first brushstrokes. Now I know better. The future is already written. It coils backward into us, whispered in the first breaths of life, looping through fragile bodies too new to carry such weight. And, sometimes if you listen closely, it speaks, in your own voice.